The morning Corporal Davo Pellucid decided he wanted. A dog was the same morning the Vorkai fleet entered low orbit over Sector 7. He was sitting on the concrete lip of the forward observation post, boots hanging over the edge, watching the families of the 44th Colonial Support Battalion move along the perimeter road below. Civilian contractors and their dependents allowed inside the wire only because the Vorkai had not yet decided that killing soft targets was strategically worth the political cost. A mother with 2 kids, a leash in each hand. 2 small dogs, some mutt breed he couldn't name, pulling forward and tangling and generally making the whole exercise look like controlled chaos. The kids laughed. The mother laughed. The dogs looked absolutely convinced they were the most important creatures in the known universe. Davo watched until they rounded the corner by the supply depot and disappeared. He went back to his monitoring station and pretended to check the atmospheric sensors, but he was really thinking about the dogs. The way the kids held the leashes like they were holding something alive and precious and entirely theirs. The weight of that, even from 100 meters up. He hadn't had anything like that in 4 years. Not since before the Vorkai came. Pellucid. Sergeant First Class Rena Voss leaned through the doorway, hair pulled back so tight it made her look perpetually annoyed, though Davo suspected she was actually perpetually annoyed. You look like someone pissed in your coffee, just thinking, do it faster. We've got a thing. The thing was a Vorkai survey drone that had gone off its standard route and was now circling Grid 7, which was adjacent to their post. Standard procedure was to log it, flag it, and wait for the drone to return to its orbital pattern. Standard procedure did not account for the drone being the size of a refrigerator and making a sound like a dying synthesizer, which was new. Davo tracked it on the secondary screen while Voss argued with battalion command over comms. The drone moved in precise geometric patterns, squares inside squares, like it was mapping something. It dipped low twice, once over the contractor housing and once over the vehicle pool, then rose back up and hovered. Command says ignore it, Voss said. Command always says ignore it. Command is not wrong 100% of the time. What's the percentage? She looked at the screen. The drone had stopped moving. It was just hanging there, maybe 60 meters up, its exterior lights cycling through amber and pale blue. Log it, she said. And don't do anything stupid. She went back to her desk. Davo logged it. Then he sat there for another 20 minutes, watching the drone not move and thinking about the dogs. The thing about 4 years of occupation, of accommodation, of careful coexistence with a species that was still deciding whether humanity was worth the administrative effort of keeping alive. The thing was, it got inside you in a way that combat never did. Combat was clean. You knew what you were doing and why. 4 years of sitting in a box and monitoring and logging and not doing anything stupid was a different kind of erosion. Davo had watched men go hollow in this post. Good men. Men who'd come in sharp and left soft, not from trauma but from the sheer relentless diminishment of having no agency. He was 31 years old, and he had not owned anything living since the cat he'd had before the Vorkai came. A gray and white animal named Atlas, who had wandered away 2 weeks into the occupation and not come back. He told himself Atlas had found somewhere better. He mostly believed it. The drone made a sound. Not the dying synthesizer sound, something else. A small chirp, almost musical, like a question mark rendered in audio. Davo stood up from his station and went to the observation slot and looked out. The drone was lower, much lower, maybe 20 meters. Its lights had shifted to a steady pale green that he hadn't seen in any of the technical documentation on Vorkai survey equipment. It was looking at him. He was aware of this without being able to explain how he was aware of it. The sensors along its leading edge were oriented directly at the observation slot. At him, he held up a hand. The drone chirped again. Davo Pellucid was not a man given to impulsive decisions. He survived 4 years in a forward observation post on an occupied planet through a combination of caution, competence, and knowing when not to push. He knew, objectively, that what he was about to do was the kind of thing Voss had specifically told him not to do. He went outside. The air had that particular quality it got in late morning, thick and slightly sweet from whatever bloomed in the tree line to the east. He stood at the base of the post and looked up, and the drone looked back at him from 20 meters and made its chirping sound a 3rd time. And this time there was something in the sequence of it. 3 short notes, then a pause, then one long one, that made him think of a dog tilting its head. Hey, he said. The drone descended to eye level. It was not a standard Vorkai survey unit, he could see that now. The casing was too smooth, the surface finish too precise. Not the rough matte black of military equipment, but something that caught the light differently, almost iridescent. And it was small. He'd clocked it as refrigerator-sized from above, but from here it was closer to the size of a large backpack. Compact, dense. It hovered with no visible propulsion, which meant either a gravity management system, well beyond anything in the intelligence files, or something else entirely. It beeped at him. He put out a hand, palm up, the way you'd offer your hand to an unfamiliar dog. The drone moved forward 3 centimeters and stopped. Okay, Devo said. He went back inside, ate his ration bar, and spent the afternoon writing the most detailed observation report of his career. He did not mention the part where he went outside. He mentioned everything else. The deviation from standard survey patterns. The color shift in the exterior lights. The apparent size discrepancy from documented Vorkai drone specs. The musical chirp pattern he had not heard before. He filed it. He went back to the observation slot. The drone was still there. Over the next week, Davo developed a theory. The drone was not a survey unit. It was not military equipment. The geometric patterns it had flown over grids Devon were not mapping patterns. They were search patterns. The kind of low-efficiency spiral a lost animal walks when it is trying to find something familiar. The color shift to green had not appeared in any Vorkai equipment file because it was not a system state. It was an emotional display. He had no hard evidence for this. He had the reports from the last 4 days of observation, the sound recordings he'd taken on his personal device, and the fact that when he had gone outside each morning that week, the drone had descended to eye level and made its chirping sound and moved forward 3 centimeters and stopped. It was waiting for something from him. He didn't know what. On day 8, he brought food. He'd thought about this more than he was willing to admit, even to himself. He didn't know if the drone consumed anything. Most drones didn't, obviously, but the way it responded to him had the particular quality of something that wanted connection and wasn't sure how to ask for it. He'd seen that in animals. He'd seen it in people too. He brought the only thing he had that seemed appropriate. A handful of the hard cheese crackers from his supplemental ration, which were small and compact, and seemed like the kind of thing you'd offer something you were trying to befriend. He held them out. The drone descended to about chest height and its surface shifted. A ripple moved across the iridescent casing, like a shiver, and then it extended a small articulated filament from its underside and touched one of the crackers. The cracker disappeared, not eaten, absorbed. The filament retracted and the cracker was simply gone, and the drone's exterior lights cycled rapidly through amber and green, and something close to white before settling back to the steady green, and it made a sound Davo had not heard before. Longer, warmer, the way a cat purrs when you find exactly the right spot behind its ears. There you go, Davo said. He named it Pip. He did not tell Voss. This turned out to be harder than he anticipated. Pip had opinions about where Davo spent his time, and those opinions were communicated clearly and immediately. The first morning Davo tried to work through the full shift without going outside. Pip descended to the observation slot and hovered directly in front of it, completely blocking the atmospheric sensor array, and made a sound like a distressed theremin until Davo went outside for 10 minutes. The second morning, Davo tried a compromise. He opened the observation slot and let Pip hover at the edge of it while he worked. And this resulted in Pip slipping through the gap and spending 40 minutes exploring the interior of the post while Davo tried to look like he was doing his job normally. Pip was fascinated by the equipment. Not in a threatening way, in the way a very smart animal is fascinated by a mechanism it wants to understand. It hovered over the communications array and made soft chirping sounds at the transmitter housing. It examined the power junction with its filament. It found the secondary screen displaying the atmospheric data and spent a long time hovering in front of it, and Davo was 90% sure it was reading the data, which was an unsettling thought he chose not to examine too closely. When Voss came in to check the morning readings, Pip had retreated to the corner of the ceiling near the ventilation intake, where it sat very still with its lights dimmed to almost nothing. Voss looked at the atmospheric data. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at Davo. Is that a Vorkai survey drone sitting in the corner of my post? It's been following me, Davo said. That's your explanation. I have a more detailed one if you want it. Voss sat down. She had the expression she got when she was deciding whether something was a problem she had to fix immediately or a problem she could manage over time. It was a calculation Davo had watched her make 100 times. Is it transmitting? I've been running scans every 6 hours. No signal activity I can detect. You can't detect everything. No, Davo agreed. Voss looked at the ceiling again. Pip's lights were still dimmed. One small amber pulse barely visible. Why is it following you? I don't know exactly. I fed it. You fed a Vorkai drone. I gave it a cracker. The expression on Voss's face cycled through about 6 distinct phases before settling on something that was not quite resignation and not quite amusement but occupied the territory between them. You understand, she said carefully, that this is either the least consequential thing that has happened at this post in 4 years, or it is an existential intelligence failure that gets us both court-martialed. Yes, and you don't know which one. Not yet. Pip descended from the ceiling, slow and deliberate, and hovered at about Voss's eye level. Its lights shifted back to the steady green. It made the chirping sound, 3 short, 1 long, and then extended its filament and very gently touched the sleeve of Voss's uniform, a contact so brief it might have been accidental. Except nothing Pip did was accidental. Voss was very still for a moment. 3 short and 1 long, Davo said. It does that. I think it might mean hello. Voss looked at the drone for a long time. It's not Vorkai military, no. It's too small. The surface material is wrong. The propulsion signature is completely different. I've been listening to Vorkai anti-grav for 4 years, and that's not what this is. She stood up slowly, not taking her eyes off Pip. What is it? I think it's lost. This was the theory Davo had been building for the past week, and not saying aloud because saying it aloud would make it real, and real would mean dealing with it. Pip's search pattern over Grid 7. The way it had responded to him specifically, not to the post, not to the equipment, but to him, a human being who had held out his hand. The fact that it was sitting in their post now because it had followed him here, and not because it had been directed to. Lost things followed warmth. Lost things attached to whatever steady presence they found first. Davo knew this. He had found Atlas's cat on the street corner, 2 blocks from his apartment building 4 years before the Vorkai came. A gray and white scrap of fur that had been following a woman in a yellow coat and transferred its attention to him when she turned away. Atlas had chosen him in about 30 seconds. Pip had taken a week, but the mechanism felt the same. Lost from what? Voss asked. That's what I don't know. The answer came 11 days later, and it was not gentle. The Vorka cruiser that appeared over Sector 7 at 0340 hours was not a survey vessel. It was a full military hull, Hammer class, its belly lit with the deep amber of active sensor sweeps. Davo was awake because Pip had woken him. A sustained, high-frequency tone that started around 0300 and built until he was sitting up in his bunk, with his heart slamming against his ribs and his hands already reaching for his boots. By the time he got to the post, Voss was already on comms with battalion command, and the Hammer class was dropping to 6,000 meters and beginning a systematic sweep of the sector. They're looking for something, Voss said, not looking up from the screen. Pip was pressed against the interior wall of the post, all lights extinguished. The silence from it was total, no chirping, no ambient hum, just a dense stillness that radiated something Davo could only call fear. He had spent enough time with Pip to trust his read of its states. It was afraid. Whatever was on that cruiser, Pip knew it and did not want to be found by it. Command wants to know if we've observed any anomalous activity in our sector, Voss said. Define anomalous. I told them no. She finally looked up. Her face was the flat, controlled expression she used when she was managing something she hadn't fully decided about yet. I told them nothing to report. Davo looked at Pip pressed against the wall. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. Start thinking about what we're going to do when they find it anyway. The sweep ran for 6 hours. Davo spent most of it at the monitoring station, running interference in the only way available to him, blocking Pip's signal signature in the atmospheric data by flagging the relevant frequency bands as equipment noise and filing erroneous calibration reports that buried the anomaly in administrative paperwork. It was the kind of thing you could do in a forward observation post, because nobody senior enough to audit you was paying close enough attention to routine sensor data. He was good at it. 4 years of sitting in a box had made him very good at finding the gaps in oversight. Pip did not move from the wall. At 0910, the cruiser shifted its sweep pattern to the Neflar sectors and began climbing altitude. At 1100, it was gone from their airspace. At 1130, Pip drifted away from the wall and floated to the center of the room, and its lights came back on. Not the steady green, but a slow cycling amber that Davo had not seen before. He sat down on the floor of the post, back against the equipment rack, and Pip descended until it was hovering at 30 centimeters from his face. It made the chirping sound. 3 short, 1 long. Hello. I know, Davo said, I know. Voss watched from across the room. It knows they were looking for it? I think so. And it knows we hid it? Yes. She let out a long breath. Pellucid, you have adopted a sentient alien vessel. I think that's accurate. How small do you think the vessel is? Davo looked at Pip, 30 centimeters at its widest, maybe 60 long. He thought about how it had absorbed the cracker, about the gravity management system, about the way it could read atmospheric data on a secondary screen. I think, he said slowly, that this might be the smallest it is. Voss stared at him. I think it might be able to change size, Davo said. I think the Vorkai wouldn't have sent a Hammer class to look for a backpack-sized survey drone. I think this is something that can be a lot bigger than what I'm looking at right now. Voss was quiet for a very long time. Don't tell Command, Davo said. I already didn't tell Command. I mean, don't tell them that part, Pellucid. She sat down heavily in her chair. If this thing is what you think it is, we are in possession of a piece of alien technology that the Vorkai military is actively searching for. That is not a small thing. I know they will come back. I know that too. And when they do, he looked at Pip. The amber cycling had slowed. Something in its lights, in the quality of their movement, reminded him of Atlas in the late evenings on his apartment couch. That complete, uncalculating weight of trust. The animal that has decided you are safe and lets itself fully rest. I don't know yet, Davo said. But I'm not handing it over. This was, he recognized, the first unambiguous decision he had made in 4 years. The first thing he had done that was not logging and monitoring and not doing anything stupid. He waited to feel afraid of it. He felt something else instead. A kind of solidity, like a foundation settling, the sense of having weight again. He gave Pip another cracker. The weeks that followed were a delicate engineering project, and Davo approached them the way he approached all problems. Methodically, quietly, with complete attention. He needed to keep Pip hidden, which meant managing the signal environment of the post, which meant filing false calibration reports and redirecting atmospheric data, and constructing a layered bureaucratic fiction that would hold long enough to matter. He was good at this. He had spent 4 years building the administrative camouflage of a man who was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. And now he turned that camouflage to a different purpose. Pip, for its part, learned fast. It learned that certain frequencies set off equipment alarms and it modulated itself accordingly. It learned that Voss's entry meant it should go to the corner of the ceiling. And it did this with such perfect consistency that after the first 2 weeks, Voss stopped checking the ceiling at all. It learned that Davo's sleeping hours were inviolable except for genuine emergency, and it learned what a genuine emergency looked like, which was a more sophisticated calibration than Davo had expected. It also learned, somewhere in the 3rd week, how to change size. Or rather, it stopped pretending it couldn't. Davo was working the night shift alone, running the standard atmospheric sweep, when he noticed that Pip was bigger. Dramatically, maybe 10% larger than usual, the edges of its casing marginally more defined, the lights slightly brighter. He didn't say anything. The next night, it was a little bigger again. By the end of the week, it was about the size of a large suitcase. And Davo had rearranged the supply shelf to give it a corner to occupy that wasn't immediately visible from the door. He thought about what Voss had said. He thought about what a Hammer-class cruiser searching for something implied about what that something was. He decided not to think about it too hard, and to just keep feeding it crackers. What he could not have anticipated was what Pip decided to do with its capabilities once it felt safe enough to use them. It started small. One morning Davo came in to find the atmospheric sensor array had been recalibrated overnight. Not broken, not tampered with in any harmful sense, just improved. Settings adjusted, noise filtering tuned, the kind of refinements that a technician would spend a week on done silently and perfectly in a single night. He ran diagnostics and found no errors. The data quality was noticeably better. He looked at Pip. Pip made the chirping sound, pleased with itself. You fixed the sensors, Davo said. Pip's lights cycled through warm amber and back to green. Okay, Davo said. Over the following days, other improvements accumulated. The power junction that had been losing 7% efficiency to a connection fault, fixed. The secondary screen that flickered in cold weather, the fault was in a component Davo hadn't even known was connected to the screen, deep in the infrastructure of the post, and Pip had identified it and corrected it without being asked. Voss noticed. She didn't say anything forthright, and then she said, "It's useful," and that was the entirety of her acknowledgement, which from Voss was essentially a declaration of affection. When the other soldiers at the post began to notice the improvements, Davo told them a technician had come through. No one questioned this. People accepted explanations that made their lives easier. What they couldn't explain, what Davo couldn't explain, was the morning they all came in to find their ration reserves had been supplemented. Overnight. Enough food for a week, precisely the items they'd been running low on, arranged with a neatness that was either algorithmic or obsessive. Davo looked at Pip. Pip was the size of a small car now, occupying the back third of the secondary equipment bay, and its surface had taken on a different quality. Less iridescent, more textured, like something settling into a form it had chosen, rather than one it was maintaining. "Where did you get food?" Davo asked. Pip extended its filament and touched the supply manifest on Davo's desk. "You read the manifest and went and got it." The filament retracted. The lights cycled green. "From where?" Pip's lights shifted to something complicated, a pattern Davo hadn't catalogued yet. He thought, watching it, that this was the equivalent of a dog that has done something technically not permitted but entirely pragmatic, and knows you know, and is waiting to see if you're going to make a thing of it. He thought of Atlas bringing dead birds to the apartment door. The same logic. Here is a thing. "I got it. It is for you. Please do not examine the method too closely." "Thank you," Davo said. He did not examine the method. The second Vorkai sweep came on a Tuesday. This one was different. Not a single hammer class moving through a standard search pattern. 2 cruisers, working in coordination, their sensor sweeps interlocking in a way that left no gap between them. Davo saw them on the monitoring array at 0200 and was already thinking through his options before he was fully awake. Pip was awake too, had been awake. Davo suspected, since before the cruisers appeared, which meant it had detected them at a range beyond their equipment's capacity, which was another data point he filed away. Voss came in at 0215. She looked at the screen and said nothing for a moment. "They know it's in this sector," she said. "Probably. The calibration trick won't work twice." No. They looked at each other. They had not had a conversation about what they would do if it came to this. They had not needed to, because they both already knew, and saying it aloud would make it the kind of thing that had to be decided rather than the kind of thing that simply was. "I need it to be small," Davo said. He went to Pip. Pip was currently the size of a small car, which was too large to hide and too large to move. Davo put his handful against its casing. The texture was warm, almost biological, a quality that still surprised him even after weeks of contact, and said, "I need you to be as small as you can be, the way you were when I first saw you." Pip's lights went through several rapid cycles. It was processing something. Then it made a sound Davo had not heard before, longer than the usual chirp, more complex in its tonal structure, and accompanied by a shift in its lights to a blue he hadn't catalogued. He thought, that is a question, or an explanation, something it needs me to understand. "I know," he said, though he didn't know. "I know. But please." The compression happened slowly, and then all at once. The car-sized mass collapsed inward in stages. Not crumpling, not folding, but contracting, each dimension reducing smoothly and completely, until Pip was the size of a backpack again, sitting on the floor of the secondary equipment bay and glowing a pale, steady blue that it had never shown before. Davo picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, dense in a way that suggested the compression was real and not a perceptual effect. He held it against his chest the way you'd hold something fragile, and walked back to the main post and sat down at his station and put Pip in the equipment footwell next to his boots and left his hand resting against it. Voss began filing false reports. The sweep ran for 9 hours. For 9 hours Davo sat at his station and ran his false calibration data and did not move his hand from Pip and did not think about what would happen if this didn't work. Thinking about what would happen if it didn't work was not useful. He ran the numbers he needed to run and filed the reports that needed filing and kept his hand on the warm surface of something he had decided to protect, and that was sufficient. At 1410, the sweep ended and the cruisers climbed back to orbit. Pip expanded slowly back to its normal size. When it reached the familiar backpack dimensions, it made the chirping sound. 3 short, 1 long, but the note was different, lower. Davo sat on the floor of the post with his back against the equipment rack, and Pip settled into the space beside him, its surface pressed against his arm, and they stayed that way for a while. "What are you?" Davo asked. Pip made the sound that meant he understood the question and couldn't fully answer it. He'd learned to read this one. It made it when he asked things beyond their shared vocabulary. "You're something important," Davo said. "To them." The lights cycled. "And you don't want to go back." The lights went still. "Okay," Davo said. He understood this too. He had understood it since the first morning Pip had descended to eye level and waited to see what he would do. Some things found a place and decided it was theirs and held on to it with everything they had. This was not a complicated thing. It was one of the oldest things. 3 days later, Pip showed him the stars. It happened at night, without preamble. Davo was on the last hour of his shift, running the routine fight Orcs. When the lights in the post dimmed and expanded to fill the back quarter of the room and its surface changed, became transparent, or seemed to, or projected something so precise against itself that the distinction between image and transparency collapsed, and the wall behind it was suddenly full of space. Not a representation of space, not a screen rendering. Something that had the particular quality of depth, the way the eye loses the ability to find a back plane and keeps searching. Stars in numbers that made the atmosphere-filtered view from the observation slot look like a child's drawing. Clusters and rivers of light. And in the center of the display, one star brighter than the others, pulsing with a rhythm Davo found himself counting without meaning to. 4 beats, pause, 4 beats, pause. Pip's home. It was pointing. The way an animal points toward what it needs, with its whole body, with something more than its whole body. The display was not ambiguous. This is where I am from. This is where my kind is. This is the distance between there and here. Davo sat with this for a long time. He said, "You want to go home." The display did not change. But you don't want to go back to them, to the ones looking for you. The pulsing of the bright star slowed, stopped. They're not your people. They had you. That's not the same thing. He was aware that he was extrapolating. He was aware that his entire understanding of Pip's interior life was a construction, an anthropomorphic interpretation of lights and sounds and behaviors that might mean something entirely different from what he read in them. He was also aware that the thing pressed against his arm had hidden from a Vorkai military sweep, with a fear that it was unmistakable in its quality, and that it had chosen to stay in a 40-square-meter observation post on an occupied planet rather than take its chances with whatever was looking for it. Some readings didn't require translation, he said. I'll help you. He did not say this with any concrete plan in mind. He said it the way you say things to something that needs to hear them before it can believe them, as a commitment, made before the method is clear. Because the commitment is what allows the method to become clear. Pip's display shifted. The stars moved, not randomly but in a deliberate sequence. Routes, options. The bright star remained centered, but around it lines appeared and faded. Each one a different trajectory, each one marked with something. Frequencies, durations. He couldn't read the specific data, but the structure was legible. It was calculating. It had been calculating probably since the second sweep. It was showing him what it had. You can get there from here, Davo said. The display condensed to a single bright line from their position to the pulsing star. If they don't intercept you. The line wavered, then steadied. What do you need? Pip's surface rippled. The filament extended and touched the communications array housing, touched the power junction, touched the atmospheric sensor that had been recalibrated and was now running it better than factory specifications. It was making an inventory, or showing him one. You need a signal, Davo said. A strong one from here. The filament retracted. The lights cycled through amber and green and the warm white that meant yes. He sat with this. Sending a signal through the communications array, strong enough to reach the coordinates Pip had shown him, would require overriding every protocol in the system, and broadcasting on a frequency that the Vorkai cruisers still in high orbit would detect immediately. They would trace it. They would come to the post. There would not be enough time to hide anything or file any false reports. He thought about this for a while. He thought about 4 years in a box, about logging and monitoring and not doing anything stupid, about the weight of the leashes the kids had held and the particular quality of trust that Atlas had had in his last years, sleeping on the foot of the bed, fully certain that the space was his. Voss needs to know, he said. He woke her. She came into the post in her off-duty clothes and stood looking at the display Pip had made, still active, still showing the line from here to the pulsing star, and was quiet for a very long time. If we send the signal, she said, they come. How long do we have? Between signal and intercept. Pip showed me the route. About 12 minutes at standard Vorkai approach velocity. Voss looked at Pip. Pip made the chirping sound, 3 short, 1 long, and Voss, without any apparent self-consciousness, said hello back. Then she said, is 12 minutes enough? I don't know. I think so. Pip moves faster than Vorkai standard when it wants to. You think so? I think so. Voss sat down. She had the calculation expression. She ran it for about 2 minutes and then she said, "If we send the signal, we can't hide that we sent it. They'll know it came from this post. They'll know we had it. Yes, we'll be arrested, probably. And you think we should do it anyway?" Davo looked at Pip. The display was still up, the single bright line from here to home. He thought about the second sweep and 9 hours with his hand against the warm surface of something that trusted him. He thought about the first morning he'd gone outside and held up his hand, and it had descended to eye level and moved forward 3 centimeters. "It found me," he said. "It didn't find anyone else. It found me and it stayed because it decided I was safe, and I was safe. And now it needs something from me that I can actually do, and I'm going to do it." He was not a man who gave speeches. That was not a speech, it was just the thing he knew. Voss was quiet, then she said, "I'll run interference on the array. Delay their trace by 2 minutes if I can." She stood up and went to her station. "Send the signal, Pellucid." He sat down at the communications array. He looked at Pip. Pip's lights were cycling through every color he had cataloged, and some hadn't. Amber and green and warm white, and the pale blue of the small hours, and something that was close to gold. It was doing the thing it did when it was about to do something significant, the full spectrum display that he had come to read as the equivalent of a deep breath. "You ready?" Davo said. Pip made the chirping sound. 3 short notes, then a pause, then 4 beats, the rhythm of the pulsing star. Home. He overrode the protocols. He killed the standard broadcast parameters and opened the array to full output, pointed it at the coordinates on Pip's display, and let the drone signal play directly through the human equipment without filtering or modification. It was a clean signal. It was a strong signal. It was the kind of signal that would be impossible to miss from orbit. The acknowledgement came in 4 minutes. Not from the Vorkai cruisers, from the direction of the pulsing star. A response signal, brief and unmistakably structured, carrying a frequency signature that the equipment translated as neither human nor Vorkai. Something else, something coming, Pip expanded. Not to car size, not to the intermediate forms Davo had seen. It expanded fully, in the post and then beyond the post, its surface flowing through the walls not by breaking them but by moving around them, through the gaps at the seams and the ventilation intakes. And what emerged into the morning air outside was something the size of a small aircraft, hovering at ground level with its surface lit in the full spectrum display, and its lights brighter than anything Davo had seen from it. He and Voss stood in the doorway and looked up at it. It was beautiful. He had not had a word for it before, because he had not seen it at full expression before. It was beautiful the way functional things are beautiful. The beauty that comes from a form that has found its exact right proportion, every surface serving a purpose, every dimension earned. In the morning light, it caught and scattered everything. The amber of the sunrise, the pale of the sky, the particular cool blue that lived at the edge of dawn. It turned to face them. The communications array inside the post was broadcasting the Vorkai trace. Voss's interference had bought them 1:40, she said, which meant they had about 4 minutes before the cruisers began their descent. Davo stepped out of the doorway and stood in the open air under Pip's full size and looked up. The filament extended, longer than he had seen it, and finer, and it touched his upraised hand with a precision that was exact and deliberate. The contact lasted 3 seconds, then it retracted. Pip made the chirping sound 1 final time, 3 short, 1 long, and then the 4-beat rhythm that meant home, then a 5th note Davo had never heard before, longer than the others. Rising in pitch, he didn't know what it meant. He knew what it felt like. He held up his hand. Pip rose. Not the slow hovering drift of the past weeks, but a launch, vertical and immediate. The gravity management system he had spent 6 weeks trying to understand expressing itself at full capacity. The displacement of air coming down in a wave that flattened the grass around the post and made Voss grab the doorframe. It was 50 meters up in the time it took him to blink. 100. And then it was in the sky, moving on the vector it had shown him, the bright line to the pulsing star, and it was moving fast enough that the shape of it blurred at the edges, and then faster. And then it was a point of light, and then it was not there anymore. The Vorkai cruisers arrived 6 minutes later. Davo and Voss were standing outside the post. They had not run. There was nowhere useful to run to, and running would have required them to have done something wrong, which was a position Davo did not occupy. He had helped something get home. He had used the equipment at his post to do it. He had done it without authorization. All of this was true, and none of it was wrong, and he was prepared to be precisely as clear about this as the situation required. The cruisers landed their ground teams at the perimeter, And on the ground teams came to the post and the senior officer, a Vorkai, with the rank insignia of a systems commander, which was higher than Davo had expected, came to where he and Voss were standing and looked at them for a long time without speaking. Davo waited. The systems commander said, in the flat machine translation that all Vorkai military used for human interactions, "You transmitted the location signal." "Yes," Davo said. "The unit has left the atmosphere." "Yes, you understood what it was." "Not exactly." "I understood enough." The systems commander looked at him with the long, still attention of a species that communicated primarily through pattern recognition and had learned imperfectly to read human facial expressions. Davo met its gaze. He was not pretending to be calm. He was calm. The decision had been made and he stood inside it without regret, and that was a state that required no performance. The commander said, "The unit was not Vorkai property." Davo waited. "It was recovered from a derelict vessel of unaffiliated origin 14 years ago. Its status was unclear. There was a faction within our military authority that believed its capabilities made it a resource. There was another faction that believed it was a thinking entity and that its detention was indefensible." The machine translation rendered this with its usual flatness, but Davo caught the structure underneath. The architecture of a very old internal argument, finally reaching a conclusion it had not been able to reach on its own terms. "Your action may be considered a resolution," Voss said very quietly. "Son of a bitch." The systems commander looked at her. "Sorry," she said. I'm processing." The systems commander looked back at Davo. "There will be formal proceedings. Your unauthorized use of communications equipment in violation of occupation protocols is a matter of record. I understand. The outcome of those proceedings is uncertain." "I understand that too." Another long pause. The systems commander looked at the sky in the direction Pip had gone. "The unit," it said. "It functioned normally during its time in your post." Davo thought about the recalibrated sensors, the repaired power junction, the week's worth of rations. He thought about 9 hours with his hand against a warm surface, and Pip pressed against his arm in the dark. He thought about the stars displayed against its surface, the bright line home, the sound it had made that rose in pitch at the end. "Yes," he said. "It did well." The systems commander nodded once, a gesture it had learned, Davo suspected, from watching humans for a long time. Then it turned and walked back to its ground team, and the ground teams returned to the cruisers, and the cruisers lifted off and went back to orbit. Davo stood in the morning air outside the post and looked at the sky for a while. Voss came to stand beside him. They were quiet together, which was the state they did most of their best thinking in. After a while she said, "The proceedings, I know, could go either way, I know. But you'd do it again." He looked at the sky. The place where a point of light had been and wasn't anymore. He thought about 3 short notes and 1 long one. He thought about the first morning, his hand held out palm up, and the 3 centimeters of cautious advance. The specific texture of trust being offered by something that had no particular reason to trust and chose to anyway. "Yeah," he said. He went back inside and started writing the most detailed, most honest observation report of his career. He put everything in it. From the first deviation in the drone's survey pattern to the final transmission. From the cracker he'd fed it on day 8 to the 4-beat rhythm it had played him against the stars. All of it. The complete record of something small that had found somewhere safe, and the 2 people who had decided, without any particular ceremony, that keeping it safe was worth the cost. He filed it at 0930. At 1000 he found a small package on his bunk that had not been there before. He did not know how it had gotten there. He did not examine the method too closely. Inside the package, small, dense, wrapped in a material that caught the light in a way that was neither iridescent nor ordinary, but something between, was a single round object the size of a golf ball, warm to the touch, its surface cycling slowly through amber and green and the warm white that meant yes. He sat on his bunk and held it. Outside, somewhere in the sector, a dog barked. 1 short bark, then 2. Then the particular sustained note of an animal that has found something interesting and wants the world to know about it. Davo Pellucid sat in his bunk on an occupied planet 4 years past, the point where anything had felt like his, and held something warm in his hands, and thought that the distance between a point of light and the place you came from was not always as large as the math suggested. He thought that some things found you, that some things flew 300 meters across contested airspace, and descended to eye level and moved forward 3 centimeters and waited, because they had no other vocabulary for what they needed, and that particular gesture was the best one they had. He thought that being found was not a small thing. He put the warm object on his bunk next to his boots and went back to his station and ran the morning's atmospheric data and filed the routine calibration report and noted, without particular surprise, that the sensor array was reading at 104% efficiency, which was within factory specifications and better than it had been yesterday, and would probably be better still tomorrow. He logged it as normal.